Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you to this event, which is being organized by the Sharjah International Book Fair. And we have some very special guests here today, including the ruler of Sharjah. And I'd like to begin, if I may, by telling you that my name is Bill Swainson. I work as an editor and have worked in publishing for about 40 years. And today, it's my very great pleasure to introduce you to Mohammed Murr, who is going to talk to us about Emirati literature today. And for those of you who don't know, the Emirates are 7 states, and they have been wonderful in supporting Arabic literature in translation and other initiatives, of which the Sharjah Book Fair is one of the leading initiatives. My own interest in literature from the Arab world begins with working with colleagues at Banipal, which is a magazine that translates Arabic literature into English, and also working with the Hay Festival, who ran a wonderful promotion in Beirut about 6 or 7 years ago, called Beirut 39. But today we're going to talk, Mohammed Murr will talk about Emirati literature and culture generally. And I just want to say a couple of words about him. I've been lucky enough to read his stories in English. He was translated by one of the best translators from Arabic into English, Peter Clark, and began with a book called Dubai Tales. So for those of us who don't read Arabic, this is a book to look for, as also is The Wink of the Mona Lisa, which is a later collection of stories. Now, Mr. Murr has published 15 books of stories in his lifetime, but recently he has been very busy with the cultural affairs of the Emirates and was in charge of the cultural activities of the Emirates for a number of years, and then was elevated further to be the Speaker of the Federation of National Council. So if any of us is inclined to get out of order, we know that we have a professional speaker and moderator to keep us in check. So without more ado, I would like to hand over to Mohammed Murr to tell us about Emirati literature.
Thank you, Bill. I am very happy and honored to be in the London Book Fair. We are also honored to have His Highness Sheikh Dr. Sultan Muhammad Al-Qasimi with us, who is a great patron of literature, of art, of culture in general in Sharjah, in the whole of the Emirates, and in the Gulf. In fact, his activities extended even to different Arab capitals. Literature in UAE is part of literature in the Arab world because of the historical dimension that UAE speak Arabic, and people of UAE are part of a whole nation, which is the Arabic nation. The Arabic nation, as you know, have a long history in literature that began before 1,500 years ago. And through that long period, many different type of literature flourished, whether it was in poetry, fiction, or other type of literary expressions. UAE as a nation, in a political term, came only to being before more than 4 decades. But the people of UAE, through many generations, they had a very strong connection with their brothers in the rest of the Arab world. But because of the seclusion of the area, because of the underdevelopment in many parts of our educational system, because of the high rate of illiteracy, we were hindered in participating in the flourishing of literature in the early 20th century. As you know, in the Arab world, from the beginning, late 19th century and early 20th century, many Arab writers began to write in a different way, whether in poetry, which was the classical way of Arabic literary expression, or in the new ways of literary expression like the short stories and the novel. That developed in Damascus, in Beirut, in Cairo, and part of that development came to us through the literary magazines that we used to get from these capitals. Our people used to read these type of magazines, and they began also looking at their way of literary expression. Most of the literary expression in UAE before the 50s were concentrated on the Nabati poetry, which is a very popular type of writing poetry. After the 50s, when we began to have connections with the development of literature in the Arab world, many new talents came to being in UAE. One of the first writers to talk about modernity, for example, in poetry was Ahmad Amin al-Madani. His first collection of poetry, which is called the Harvest of the Years, which came in the 60s, in his introduction to that book, he talked about the modern movement in international poetry. He talked about T.S. Eliot, he talked about Baudelaire, he talked about many poets who were really in the vanguard of the modern trend in poetry. Then in fiction, the first novel, which was written by a UAE author, Rashid al-Naimi, his novel Shahinda, he published it in Egypt because he studied in Egypt, and from there he got the influence. After that, in fact, the great promoter, the great vehicle that pushed for the development of literature in UAE was the formation of our country in the 2nd of December in 1971. That was really the biggest advancement in our recent history. After the formation of our modern state, the introduction of the school system, the introduction of universities, the introduction of also missions to the West for our students to study there. All of this led to the development in fiction and in poetry and in literary criticism. So this development led to a renaissance, led to a flowering of many talents, not only of males but females also. And with the also introduction of modern press in the UAE, we found many writers began to write in our newspapers like Al-Khalij, Al-Ittihad, Al-Bayan, many newspapers. And they began to publish their early experiments in modern literature in the literary sections of Al-Khalij or in the literary section of Al-Bayan or Al-Ittihad. They wrote their modern poetry, they wrote their first fiction there, and this type of journalism played a big role in advancing literature and in bringing this literature to the attention of the whole population. Now, beside this also, we find that the real development in quality and quantity in our literature began in the late 70s and early 80s. From that time on, we found many poets that came up with collections of their poetry. Many short story writers also, they came with their collections of short stories. We found many novelists who brought up their new novels. And there was also a movement, although slow, of literary criticism in that time. Beside this, we had also new organizations like the Writers' Union in Sharjah. We had also some governmental bodies, semi-governmental bodies like the Department of Culture in Sharjah, like the Cultural Foundation in Abu Dhabi, like the Association, Science and Culture Association in Dubai. Many of these organizations helped push the cause of literature and encouraged many talents in UAE. This is in a general terms. Now, when we come to the trends in the literature in UAE, we find two trends, generally speaking. The first trend is the traditionalist. And in poetry, we find that traditionalists still wrote in the rhymed and in the measured style of the old classical Arabic poem. It's true that the content of those poems is not like the court poems of the past, but it is now talking about nationalistic issues. It's talking about, for example, romantic issues. It's talking about modern issues. But the style itself remains the old rhymed and measured style. We call it in Arabic al-uslub al-mawzun al-muqaffa. That continued in literature, and there are many practitioners of this, like Sultan Khalifa, Hamad Bushhab, Ahmad Amin Madani. Many of those people, they continue writing with the old style. We find also young writers who began to divert from that classical style, and they wrote شعر التفعيلة. تفعيلة it's still rhymed, but it's not measured like the classical Arabic poetry. It kind of change in the style that they write the poem. Plus also we find another group that chose to get rid of the whole rhymed and measured style, and they write al-sha'r al-hurr, which is the free verse style. And that we find also many writers like Rabia Khamis or Habib al-Sayyigh or many of those people who wrote in that style. The content also of writing in the modern style went very far from the old classical courtly style. They began to write about more philosophical issues. They began to write about very existential questions. They wrote about life and death. They wrote about things that the classical or the traditional poet never touched upon. And this type of writings were similar to the writings of poets in Lebanon or Syria or Iraq or Egypt. And they were influenced also by the poetry of Nizar Qabbani, of Adonis, of Ahmad Abdul Sabur, of Badr Shakir Sayyab, Buland al-Haidari, all those distinguished poets in the Arab world. So our poets, whether males or females, they began writing also in the same style, and also they began touching in the same ideas in their poetry. In fiction, also, we have similar division between traditionalist and modernist, and as anybody who can read this work, which I chose for the Department of Culture in Sharjah for a couple of years, I chose many short stories and also one chapter for a novel where I saw the new development. We found some writers who still write short stories or novels more in the classical style, in which they follow the techniques and the themes that were developed in Europe in the 19th century and early 20th century, in the works of Chekhov, in the works of Guy de Maupassant, in the works of Dickens, in the works of Émile Zola. So they follow these techniques, and we find some of them who wrote in a different way, in which they tried to imitate the styles of, for example, magical realism, or they tried to, this stream of consciousness which developed in the UK and other European countries. And they tried to break the classical way of telling a story, like the experience of Nathalie Sarraute and Alain Robbe-Grillet in France. And because also of the heavy heritage of poetry, you find that although they try to write this in a modern style, but still their fiction is heavy in the poetic content that it have, that it sometimes prevent you from seeing how the plot developed in some of their fictions. But still, this was there, and we find many experiences of those poets and writers of novels. Now, all of these writings, they also reflect the development in the society. You know, UAE in the last 4 decades went into a great upheaval in, for example, the level of education, the relationship between the generations, in the status of women in society, in the exposure to external influences. All of this led to many problems in the family, problems between the generations, problems in the personal psyche of the society. And literature usually reflects this type of development in society. Sometimes they try to cope with these changes, which is not easy, because in many countries this development, it took them 100 years at least to go through. In our country, it's only 20, 30 years, and we went in this very accelerated development. This led to lots of problems. Literature tried to do this catharsis. Let's try to absorb this psychologically, mentally. Now, how they succeed in that, it depends on the level of creativity of each writer, whether he's writing poetry or he's writing fiction. Any person who is following UAE literature can see that many styles and many different experiments are reflecting a part of society. The traditionalists, they represent a good size of society, where they try to cling to the past because they see that there are lots of things in the past that we should conserve, that we should keep. The people who go to the modern style, they think that we have to bring modern way of living to our life. We have to experiment, we have to open up, we have to... So the modern writers, they talk to that segment of society. And like in every societies, literature is really a reflection of society, of the different segments of society, of how the dialogue between these groups can push society forward. Usually, you cannot have one trend that will, be suitable for all tastes of readers and all tastes of segments of society. So, in a dynamic society, you should have this type of different literary and artistic expressions, and that is what's going on in UAE. Now, what can we look for the future in UAE literature? UAE literature now, because of the opening to the different trends in international literature, because also of the developments in the technology of the internet, because of the development in the way that people publish, because of the trend now to read not only books but only electronic books. All of this led to many new developments. Now, many of our universities, for example, teach in English. The English is the first language medium. So we find now some of our writers, they write in English directly. They don't write in Arabic. We have Maha Gargash, for example, one of our lady writer. She wrote 2 novels in English, and they were published, I think, by Bloomsbury. We find many people who sometimes, even when they write their text, they try to introduce these type of words that we call it Arab English, or in there, because this reflects the society. Because many of our youngsters, they use this language which have a mixture of some English vocabulary in it. Also, a new trend is very positive in UAE, the introduction of private publishing companies, which were established by young writers themselves and by publishers. And now we have, I think, Mr. Ahmadi can tell us, maybe we have about 15 20 publishers, individual publishers or independent publishers. Before, we didn't have this number. Before, the government was publishing most of the fiction and the writings. Now, thank God, these new publishing houses will help the government and will also give a new freedom in writing, and will improve in this level, whether in writing or in publishing. Now, also many writers, they begin their literary experiments in the net directly, whether in their blogs or in different sites in the internet. All of this will lead also to many development in the future. I don't want to talk much about these things. I think if we open the floor for question and answer, then I can respond to many questions, and I can elaborate in other things that maybe people want to know about.
Okay, well, before we do that, do we have a microphone for the audience? We do. Good. So I'm going to ask one question first, and then if you raise your hand, the microphone will come to you, and everyone will be able to hear your question. So my question, Mr. Murr, is this. You described in your talk that different writers were talking to different sectors of society. There's a sense, if you like, of fragmentation. What are your thoughts on the advent of a writer who can speak to everyone?
Well, that can happen in society, but it is rarely, because usually, as you know, from the early 20th century, you have many trends in literature, and you find people who wanted to break barriers and people who wanted to really experiment wildly in literature. So always you will find people who are still writing more to the audience that they used to write to, and people who write to a new audience, or they wanted to create a new audience also in this.
Yeah.
It's not easy to have a writer whom people will agree upon, and you will find a person who became afterward an icon for his country, but when he began writing, maybe he was not appreciated by many of the old generation who thought that he was a rebel, or they thought that he was really writing something which is not according to tradition. It is very difficult to have this writer who will be a national, figure whom everybody will agree on his writing.
Right. Now we have our first question over to my right.
Talal Salim, an Emirati poet and a publisher as well. I was privileged to be one of the poets who was in this book translated to different languages. My question is direct to the point: why Emirati writers really did not reach outside the Arab world, getting published through any world international publishers, and what's stopping that in your point of view? Thank you.
I think this is a problem of reaching to the international audience is related to our institutions. Now, for example, in Sharjah, because the Sharjah Book Fair and the Sharjah Culture Department, under the guidance of His Highness, they are trying to link with international publishers, with international translators. If you have a treasure, or if you have, really an active writing, and people don't know about it, then they will not translate it. But you have to try to, I will not use the word market, but try to make people understand what you have by introducing your literature to them. Now, thank God, also we have many young translators in English to Arabic literature, not only of UAE literature, but also in literature in Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and other countries. I think by collaborating with these young translators, this will open the door for more of our writers to be translated to English. Also, translating poetry is very difficult. Fiction is much easier, but poetry, as Bill knows, is not easy. And always in translation, it will lose some of its beauty that is particular to the language itself.
Yeah. I think I would just add to that one of the good things that came out of the project I was involved in Beirut was that we were able to work with about 16 new translators, and 10 years previous to that, there would not have been 16 young French, British, American language students who would have been able to translate from Arabic. So this is a good change. But there is also the challenge that how do British editors, who are famous for not speaking any other languages apart from English and possibly French, how are they going to be able to read the books that come from the Arab world? Well, one of the things that has had a very good impact, and it is about marketing, and one has to sort of, as they say, when you eat with the devil, you better use a long spoon. The EPAF, the Arab Booker Prize, has provided a platform for some of the best fiction to become visible to Western editors. And I think it's not one thing only, but all these things together are beginning to create a different world in which there are not just one or two translators from the Arabic into the English, as was the case in the day of Peter Clarke or Dennis Johnson's Davis, but there may be a dozen or 20, all of a very high standard. This, together with good publicity, these are the things that will create the chance for new fiction from the Arab world, and particularly from the Emirates, to be read in English. Question from the other side.
Hello, I'm Nigel Fletcher-Jones. I'm the director of the American University in Cairo Press. I must say I enjoyed very much your talk today, and we are just launching a new imprint for Arabic language, Arabic fiction in translation into English. And so I'd love to have the opportunity to talk to you perhaps after this to see whether indeed one of the problems that we've had is finding contacts in other Middle Eastern countries that we can then attract to our publishing program.
What will your new imprint be called?
It's called Hoopoe.
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 Great.
After the bird.
Very good. Now, do we have any other questions?
No, I want to talk about the Hoopoe.
Okay.
Hoopoe at the beginning was publishing children books. That's true? No, it's not that one. Another one. Yes. Okay.
Okay.
I was just mixed.
Now, we were going to have another question from this side, over here, right in the very front.
Hi. Hello. That's working now.
Quite hard given
Yeah.
where you're sitting.
Hi, I'm Ben from the National in UAE. Interesting listening to your talk. I just wanted to ask, you were talking about writers, different kinds of writers and different kinds of audiences. What kind of writer did you want to be? And what kind of audience were you trying to capture?
It's difficult for a writer to choose from the beginning what type of writer he wanted to be. When a person writes, he just wanted to express himself. Now, how it developed afterward, it depends on what background he had. Now, this background, sometimes literary, sometimes social, sometimes it's personal. And in my stories, they are a kind of mixed bag of kind of realism mixed with also romantic trends. Also, there is some sarcasm in some of these stories. But before all of this, my intention is to write in a way that reflect society and to talk about the human side of life. I was influenced mainly by the humanistic trend in the works of Anton Chekhov, and I found that very touching, and that's what influenced me more in writing stories. There are people who emphasize more on the philosophical side of fiction writing, or they emphasize, for example, the stylistic nature of his writing. Mine it's emphasizing more on the human side of writing.
Now, I can add a little something to that, which is that in an essay about Mohammed's stories, which Peter Clark wrote for an issue of Banipal, which you can still get, it's a back issue from 4 years ago, he says, summing up at the end, "Not least is Mr. Al-Murr a wonderful conversationalist. He is quick to note ironies and absurdities in the human condition. He can observe and absorb the detail of an individual's life, whether he is a wealthy Dubai merchant or whether he is an Asian mall stallholder. A few hours with Mohammed makes you see the world with a wider perspective and a kindlier eye." And that's a wonderful tribute from somebody who spent their lifetime translating from the Arabic into the English. Now, sadly, our short time has come to an end. So please will you join me in thanking Mohammed Al-Murr for talking to us about Emirati literature.